There's a specific line inside every empath that most people, including the narcissist standing on the other side of it, never actually believe exists. Not because empaths don't have limits, they do, and they're often deeper and more resilient than anyone else's, which is exactly why so few people ever see them tested to their actual end. But when that line finally gets crossed, something happens that looks almost nothing like what came before it, and it catches everyone off guard, including very often the empath herself. This is what we're walking through today, not the slow, familiar cycle of patience, forgiveness, and quiet accommodation that defines most of a relationship with a narcissist, but the specific, decisive moment when all of that finally permanently runs out and what happens in its place. Let's start by understanding why this moment is so different from every other conflict that's come before it, because on the surface, it can look deceptively similar. There's likely been no shortage of arguments, no shortage of moments where you've said in the heat of frustration that you're done, that this is the last time, that you can't keep doing this. Most of those moments, if you're honest, weren't actually the line. They were frustration, real and valid, but still operating within a relationship you hadn't yet fully released the hope of repairing. The actual line, the one that produces genuine, lasting change rather than another cycle of conflict and reconciliation, is something categorically different. And it's worth understanding exactly what separates it from every earlier moment that felt at the time like it might be the final one. Here's the key distinction. Every previous last straw was still fundamentally about the relationship. The anger, however intense, was still oriented toward wanting something to change within the connection you were fighting to preserve. This final moment isn't like that. It doesn't come from anger at all, even though anger might be present somewhere underneath it. It comes from a kind of exhausted clarity, the sudden total recognition that you've been trying to fix something that was never actually going to be fixed through more patience, more understanding, or more of your own effort. This clarity doesn't feel like rage. It often feels closer to a strange, quiet calm, which is precisely why it's so disorienting to the narcissist when it finally arrives, because they've spent the entire relationship calibrated to detect and respond to anger, not to this. This is worth understanding in depth because it explains something that confuses a lot of people trying to understand why a specific incident, sometimes one that seems from the outside smaller than plenty of earlier ones, ends up being the actual breaking point. It's rarely about the severity of the individual incident. It's about timing relative to an internal threshold that's been quietly, invisibly filling for a very long time, built from every previous moment of forgiveness, every previous excuse made, every previous time you told yourself this was the last time and then somehow found a way to stay anyway. The specific incident that finally crosses the line often isn't the worst thing that's ever happened. It's simply the moment the accumulated weight of everything before it finally exceeds what you're capable of continuing to carry, regardless of how that particular moment compares in severity to everything that preceded it. So what actually happens once that threshold is crossed? Let's walk through it in stages, because it unfolds in a specific, recognizable pattern that's worth understanding, both for what it looks like from the outside and for what it actually feels like from the inside if you're the one living through it. The first thing that happens is an internal silence that has nothing to do with external quiet. This is worth distinguishing clearly from ordinary anger, which tends to be loud, at least internally. A flood of thoughts, a rehearsal of everything you want to say, a kind of urgent, activated energy demanding immediate release. This is different. It's the sudden absence of that urgency altogether. The thoughts that would normally be racing simply aren't there. What replaces them is something closer to stillness, an almost eerie clarity where the situation finally stops requiring interpretation. You're not confused anymore about what's happening or why. You're not searching for the explanation that would make this forgivable one more time. You simply suddenly see it plainly without the usual fog of hope and doubt that's been clouding your perception for as long as you've been trying to make this relationship work. Here's what makes this moment so significant and why it functions so differently from every earlier conflict. This clarity doesn't require any further processing to arrive at a decision. In every previous conflict, there was likely a period afterward where you thought it over, weighed the relationship's good moments against the bad ones, talked yourself into giving it another chance because some part of you still believed the effort might eventually pay off. This moment doesn't include that period because the deciding has already happened. Somewhere beneath conscious awareness, built from the accumulated weight of everything that came before. What arrives in this moment isn't a decision being made, it's a decision being recognized, fully formed as something that's already true. The second thing that happens, often within the same conversation or the same encounter, is a kind of behavioral shift that the narcissist almost never anticipates, precisely because it doesn't match any of the responses they've learned to expect and manage. There's no explosive confrontation, even though you might have every reason to explode after everything that's led to this point. There's no tearful pleading, no repeated explanation of exactly how much this has hurt, no attempt to make them finally understand the full weight of what they've done. Something as simple as, "I'm done," or "This is the last time I'm going to explain this to you," or sometimes nothing verbal at all. Just a shift in behavior so quiet it takes the narcissist days, sometimes weeks, to fully register that something fundamental has actually changed. Here's why this flat, low-intensity delivery is so much more disorienting to a narcissist than any dramatic confrontation would be. And it's worth understanding the mechanism clearly because it explains almost everything about what happens next. A narcissist's entire relational toolkit is built to respond to emotional intensity, to de-escalate anger through charm, to counter tears with performed remorse, to meet accusations with reframing and counter-accusation. Every one of these tools requires something to work against, some emotional charge to redirect or absorb. Flat, quiet finality gives them nothing to work with. There's no anger to de-escalate because there isn't any anger present in the delivery. There's no visible devastation to comfort your way back from because devastation isn't what this moment actually contains. There's no accusation requiring a defense because you're not accusing them of anything anymore. You're simply stating a fact about what you're going to do next, a fact that doesn't require their agreement or understanding in order to be true. This is why so many empaths report that this specific moment, the one where they finally genuinely reach their limit, produces almost no immediate reaction from the narcissist at all. At least not the reaction you might expect after years of watching them respond dramatically to far smaller provocations. In the moment itself, they often seem almost unbothered, sometimes even dismissive, because your flat calm doesn't register in the moment as the significant shift it actually represents. This is worth understanding clearly if you're currently in the early days after reaching this exact point yourself, because it can feel deeply disorienting and even invalidating when the moment that felt so enormous to you seems to barely register on their end. Their apparent indifference in this initial moment isn't evidence that your line didn't matter. It's evidence that they haven't yet recognized what kind of line you've actually drawn. The third thing that happens, usually over the days and weeks that follow this initial moment, is the narcissist's gradual, dawning realization that this specific instance of your withdrawal is genuinely different from every previous one. And this realization tends to arrive precisely because their usual tools, deployed with the confidence born of years of previous success, simply don't produce the usual results. The testing begins, familiar from everything we've discussed in earlier videos. Low-effort messages checking whether the door has actually closed, escalating attempts at contact when the low-effort version fails, appeals to nostalgia or manufactured urgency designed to provoke the engagement your flat calm has denied them. What's different this time, and what eventually forces the recognition that something has genuinely shifted, is that none of it works, not because you're performing indifference as a strategy, but because the exhausted clarity that produced your flat, quiet finality in the first place has nothing left underneath it for their testing to actually find and exploit. This is worth understanding as the actual mechanism behind why this specific breaking point, once reached, tends to be so much more permanent than every earlier moment that felt, at the time, like it might be the final one. Earlier moments were still fueled by hope, even when that hope was buried under real hurt and real anger, hope that things could still change, hope that enough communication or enough patience might eventually produce a different outcome. That hope, however deeply buried, created exactly the kind of investment a narcissist's testing tools are specifically designed to locate and exploit. The moment when an empath is finally genuinely pushed too far is different precisely because the hope has been fully, completely exhausted by that point, not suppressed, not hidden, but actually structurally gone, replaced by the kind of clarity that simply doesn't have anything left in it for pressure to work against. Here's what's worth understanding about the internal experience of this shift, because it matters enormously for how you interpret it if you're currently living through something like it yourself. This moment often doesn't feel like victory, and it rarely feels like the empowering, decisive clarity that gets portrayed in stories about finally standing up to a narcissist. It frequently feels like grief, a strange, quiet, almost anticlimactic grief for the relationship you'd hoped this could have been, for the years of effort that didn't produce the outcome you'd worked so hard toward, for the version of this person you once believed you saw glimpses of, who turned out to be smaller and less consistent than the hope you'd built around them. This grief is worth honoring rather than rushing past, because the clarity that finally allows you to set a firm boundary isn't the same thing as being fully healed from everything that led you to that point. It's simply the moment the accumulated evidence finally outweighed the accumulated hope, which is its own significant, difficult transition, deserving of real space to process rather than immediate demand for triumphant certainty. There's a fourth thing worth naming here as well, because it often surprises empaths who reach this point without fully anticipating it, a kind of quiet, persistent guilt that can arrive alongside the clarity, even when the clarity itself is completely justified and long overdue. This guilt doesn't mean the decision was wrong. It's simply the residue of years spent in a relationship structure that trained you to prioritize the other person's comfort over your own boundaries. And that training doesn't disappear instantly just because you finally decisively acted against it. Recognizing this guilt for what it is, a leftover pattern rather than accurate information about whether you're doing the right thing, is an important part of actually holding the boundary you've just set, rather than letting old, familiar guilt eventually erode the clarity that got you here in the first place. This brings us to the part of this story that matters most, because everything we've discussed so far describes the moment itself and its immediate aftermath, but what actually happens next, in the weeks and months that follow, determines whether this genuinely becomes the permanent shift it initially appears to be, or whether it slowly, quietly erodes back into another cycle you'll eventually find yourself trying to escape again. Here's the honest truth about this period, and it's worth understanding clearly before you find yourself living through it. The days and weeks immediately following this breaking point are almost always harder than the moment of clarity itself, not easier. This surprises a lot of people because the initial clarity can feel so complete, so obviously correct, that it seems like it should simply carry you forward without much additional struggle. What actually happens is different. The narcissist's escalating attempts at contact, the guilt residue we just discussed, the strange, unfamiliar quiet of a life that's suddenly not organized around managing someone else's needs, all of this converges into a period that requires real, ongoing effort to navigate, even when the original decision was completely clear and completely correct. This is worth understanding specifically because it explains why so many empaths, having genuinely reached this breaking point once, sometimes find themselves pulled back despite the clarity that initially felt so unshakable. The pullback rarely happens because the original clarity was wrong. It happens because the difficult period that follows genuine boundary setting gets misinterpreted as evidence that something's gone wrong, that maybe the decision was too hasty, too harsh, too disconnected from the good moments that also existed within the relationship. This misinterpretation is worth naming directly because recognizing it in advance is one of the most protective things you can do for yourself during this specific window. Difficulty after a boundary is not the same as evidence the boundary was mistaken. Grief, loneliness, the strange unfamiliarity of a life reorganized around your own needs instead of someone else's, All of this is simply what genuine change actually feels like while it's happening, not a signal that the change itself was incorrect. Here's what actually determines whether this breaking point becomes permanent, and it's simpler than most people expect, even though it's genuinely difficult to execute consistently. Whether you continue treating your own exhausted clarity as sufficient justification for the boundary without requiring it to be relitigated every time old guilt, old hope, or the narcissist's escalating attempts at contact create pressure to reconsider. This is worth understanding as an ongoing practice rather than a single decision made once and then automatically sustained. Every wave of guilt, every nostalgic memory that surfaces unexpectedly, every escalating message from the narcissist testing whether the door has really closed, each of these moments requires you to return again to the same clarity that produced the original decision without needing to fully re-argue the case to yourself each time it's tested. This is where the internal work matters more than anything happening on the narcissist side of this equation. If you find yourself weeks into this new boundary, constructing detailed mental arguments defending your decision every time doubt or guilt resurfaces, that's actually a sign the boundary needs more internal reinforcement, not evidence that the boundary itself was wrong. The goal isn't to never feel the pull of doubt or guilt again. That's an unrealistic standard that sets you up for unnecessary self-criticism. The goal is simply to notice the pull, understand where it's coming from, and continue holding the boundary anyway, the same way you'd continue holding any position you know to be correct, even while some part of you experiences discomfort about holding it. I want to address something important here about what this breaking point actually means for your relationship to your own empathy going forward, because it's a question that comes up often, and it deserves a direct answer. Reaching this point, the moment where a narcissist finally pushes you too far and something in you permanently, decisively shifts, doesn't mean your capacity for deep feeling, generous patience, or genuine compassion has been damaged or diminished. It means you've finally learned, through real and difficult experience, the specific difference between patience that serves genuine growth and patience that simply enables continued harm. This distinction matters enormously because empaths who reach this breaking point sometimes worry afterward that they've become colder, harder, less capable of the deep care that defined who they were before this relationship. What's actually happened is more precise than that. You've learned where your empathy belongs and where it doesn't, which is different from losing access to it altogether. If you're currently approaching this exact threshold yourself, sensing that something in you is close to the exhausted clarity we've described today, even if you haven't fully arrived there yet, I want you to understand that this moment, when it comes, will very likely not feel like the empowering, decisive turning point you might be imagining. It will likely feel quiet, strange, almost anticlimactic, followed by a period of real difficulty that has nothing to do with whether your decision was correct. Trust the clarity when it arrives, even without the dramatic certainty you might expect to accompany it. And trust that the difficulty which follows isn't evidence against the decision, but simply what real permanent change actually requires you to walk through. On the other side of years spent believing that patience alone might eventually be enough, it never actually was, and it was never supposed to be. What was always going to be enough eventually was you, finally, fully, reaching the end of what you were willing to keep giving to someone who never demonstrated they were capable of giving anything comparable back. That ending, however quiet, however anticlimactic it might feel in the moment it finally arrives, is the only one that was ever actually going to hold.